This is going to work best if people interrupt and ask questions as we go along, right? I have no problem in speaking for all of the available time and beyond. But if you don't understand something, you disagree with something, then please say so, right? Don't promise to be nice in the argument, but I promise to be cheerful about it, right? What I've been doing for about the past 15 or 16 years is started in IBM, so around about, it's about almost 20 years ago now. IBM took over the company for which I was strategy director. Right? It was a company called Data Sciences. It was Anglo-Dutch. And they wanted to actually basically acquire a knowledge of what a services business was. Until then, IBM manufactured things. They needed to become a service business. That company became IBM Global Services, which is now 50% of IBM. Right? So that was an interesting... We didn't know what happened. All right? We were about to float the company on the Wednesday. I've been briefing analysts for the previous year and a half. I didn't know there were that many analysts in the universe, and we'd saved up millions of pounds because every time we had a meeting, lawyers arrived in large numbers at $500 an hour, and we just had hell for about a year. Nobody had done anything on the business. We were sat around the managing director's swimming pool on the Friday night, and then we got a phone call which said, from our venture capitalists, saying IBM want to buy you, and we said go away. And then on Saturday morning IBM arrived and the venture capitalists with them, and by Sunday we were sold. Right? We invoked our right not to be bought on Sunday, because we had that right. And then the VCs told us exactly what they would do to us if we invoked the right, and we realized that we had none whatsoever. Right? And then I had to phone up the people we were going to acquire on the Wednesday when we had the cash in and say we'd been bought by IBM, at which point all deals were off. Right? It was an interesting process. Either way, from my point of view, it's quite good because I was the creative, so they just dumped me in IBM and said, here's some money, just go and do what you want and we'll see how it works out. I'd never got away with that in a small Anglo-Dutch company, but in IBM they could lose me in the rounding errors. I mean, the guy I worked for, his rounding error every quarter was $250,000. So if something came in under $250,000, it could just get lost in the accounts. Right? It's fascinating the way these big companies work. And it did take some time to get used to this. Right? And we eventually got into a thing called the knowledge wars in IBM, which if you buy me 3 or 4 pints I'll tell you about. There was a negotiated peace settlement in the manner of large companies, and I ended up running the Institute for Knowledge Management in Asia and Europe, and Larry Prusak did it in North America. And that was an interesting period. Because about 2 years into that I got a phone call from the CIA in Langley, which was a bit of a shock, and discovered they were members of the Institute. I hadn't realized they were members of the Institute, but now I knew who this rather obscure company was who turned up at all the meetings and said nothing. Right? I've done a lot of work with the intelligence community since. I was working with MI5, had dinner with the Director General, and this other guy at the table said, I should know you. I thought you were a junior knowledge officer in BP, and it turned out to be the UK head of counterintelligence. Right? So you get to manage this sort of stuff. Right? And so I get down to Washington, meet this doddery old guy who I really like. Right? He likes Patrick O'Brien's seafaring novels. We're having a great conversation, and I turn around and notice a picture of him with Ronald Reagan, and realise I'm talking with Admiral John Poindexter, who is a good Welsh socialist I meant to dislike, but I liked the guy. This is actually quite interesting when you work in Washington. You discover there's people you shouldn't like who you actually quite like, and you don't realise it till later. But that actually gave rise to everything I'm going to talk about today. We were working in narrative and complexity. John by then was sort of out of power, and he was actually managing stuff in DARPA. And he was deeply concerned about Al-Qaeda, about civilian terrorism, about the way in which you support it, and he thought we had something. Yeah? So we got a contract, and we did some work building up. We actually completed the work the day before 9/11 in the bit of the Pentagon which got hit the next day. These things happen. Where we actually showed that you could use a whole body of techniques derived from cognitive neuroscience and narrative theory to get people from radically opposing political views to have a conversation about a controversial subject without fighting each other. That took a year of development, and it's something we've done a lot since. Right? I'll come to conflict resolution later. I flew out that night, picked up the news the next day, and it was kind of like it took me 2 weeks to discover my team was still alive, because I'd left them there, and then life got very interesting for the next 3 years. And what we were focused on was weak signal detection. John actually had 2 massive DARPA programs, one of which you may have heard of, which is called Total Information Awareness, TIA, which got him into massive problems with the Congress, right? Everything went wrong around that program. And that was working with Disney and others, which basically said, I called it the one algorithm to rule them all and in the darkness bind them project, right? Because it was a bunch of high-techy people who thought it was only a matter of time before they could write an algorithm which would predict everything which would ever happen, right? Some of us thought that back in the 80s, but we grew out of it when we tried to write programs to replace doctors. So I think we realized you couldn't do it. Right? And then the other program, Genoa 2, which was myself and Merlo Park over in California, which was looking at how do you do what's now called human terrain mapping. So how do you understand human attitudes, human beliefs, how human beings make decisions? Because one of the key things in counterterrorism is when a civilian population shifts to allowing terrorists to go through their homes at night and doesn't report it. Now, we saw this in Northern Ireland around Bloody Sunday back in the 70s. One day the Catholic population were kind of like, we don't like the RA. The next day is we'll leave the doors open every night because they're on our side. And when that happens, it takes you 20 or 30 years to recover. So that was where we worked, is how do you actually map human attitudes to understand when you've got a dispositional state, a phrase I'll come back to a lot, which means one small negative event can create a massive negative change, which you won't recover from ever. And the key thing, if you don't know it in counterterrorism, is basically keeping the terrorists to a very small minority. Yeah, when the bulk of the people feel the terrorists on their side, you've just lost for a significant period of time, which is why changing attitudes is key, and don't get me onto UK policy on this at the moment. Yeah. Either way, this was rather a shock for a former world socialist, and I still remember when the CIA phoned up. I said, you do know I looked after Philip Agee in the 70s, don't you? If anybody remembers Philip Agee? Yeah, he was the CIA agent who told the truth about what happened with the destabilization of Allende, and rather like my namesake then had to leave the country, so he stayed in a series of safe houses across Europe. And I remember saying this and thinking I better own up to this now because I don't want to go to Langley and then and they said yes we do in Whitcourt on these dates. No, shut up. And then you realise they know everything. All right, this is just a warning to it. Just assume they know everything and go from that. Right? Either way, I wanted to tell you the background on this because actually counter-terrorism is like a really hard problem. If you compare that, what you're trying to do, which is to detect the really early weak signs which indicate that terrorism is likely or plausible, compared with looking at things like safety or culture within companies, it's kind of like it's a significant different order of magnitude. Yeah? And we were very lucky because we had the luxury to do that, ironically with an all-Welsh team, most of whom were socialists and one of whom was a communist, but we never told people that. Right? Working on counter-terrorism for the US government for about the next 8 or 9 years. Right? And that was fascinating. Right? And then that stuff moved across. Now, one of the things that you get into when you start to work on this, and this came originally from knowledge management, and I'm going to go through some aspects of knowledge in a minute, was a realization that the current dominant approach, which came in the 80s and is still around, works off an engineering metaphor and assumes an organization is just a type of engineering plant. Yeah? If you look what happens with business process re-engineering, with balanced scorecard, with all of these things which come in the 80s, they basically assume you can sit down and decide how you want things to be. You sit down with the consultants, with senior executives, you say in 3 years' time we want to have this type of an organization, and then you say, right, that's what we'll go and do, and then it doesn't work, so you employ change management consultants, and that doesn't work, and then you say, well, the problem is culture, so we'll blame the culture, so then you bring in the cultural change people, and that doesn't work. Yeah? By that time the executives have resigned and the whole cycle starts again with a new set of executives. Right? This is deeply depressing. And the other problem we have is that governments follow this. I've told the last 2 groups about this, it's taught in the big consultancy firms. And I'm not joking here, it is genuinely taught. Right? When you can't sell it to industry anymore because they know it doesn't work, go and sell it to government as industrial best practice and you get another 10 years lifespan. So we see Six Sigma being introduced into government at the moment when industry has largely abandoned it because they know it doesn't work. And it was never going to work in government anyway. Design thinking is now being introduced into government when it's largely failed in industry because it didn't deliver. And actually, to be honest, it's largely failed in government labs as well. And to my mind, we've got to sort of change this. And the core thing underneath this, three things which are really dangerous, is the assumption that there is a linear relationship between cause and effect which we can discover. If I do A, it will produce Y result, and if I can't predict the future, there's some failure of analysis, and that's the assumption of order. So that's one major problem. The other is the wrong metaphor, the assumption that human systems basically can be engineered. And that really came in with the dominance of IT from the 80s. If you actually look at organizational charts or anything to do with culture, they're drawn effectively like the wiring diagram of an electrical circuit, or often the sort of rather unpleasant sort of pipe work of a oil processing plant, right? Now the reality is, the work that I and others are doing is to say the metaphor should be that of an ecology, not a machine. We're not dealing with human systems with something mechanical which can be engineered. We're dealing with something very different, right? And the third thing, and this is probably the most fundamental, which is what that picture from Gaping Void is about, is the basic naive use of cases. What everybody wants to do is they want to do something other people have done with a predictable result. And the huge irony is, I was with the board of one of the world's top 15 companies about a month ago, and they said, we got you here because you do really innovative stuff which is very radical. We want to do something very different. So we went through stuff and we came up with a proposal. They said, okay, well, could you give us 5 examples of people in our industry sector who have done this before and the results they got? And you just sort of say, oh my God, here we go again, right? But that is oh so common. Now, what I'm going to argue as we go through this is the nature of the world we live in now. The level of uncertainty and the level of change is so high that using the past to make statements about the future is fundamentally dangerous. And we got several dangers on this, and for people who were here yesterday morning, apologies, I need to repeat this, but known phenomena. One is the confusion of correlation with causation. The fact I've got 15 or 16 cases, so the normal approach is find 15 or 16 cases where the people managing the organisation say they got a good result. You notice I'm putting some qualifications in here. Do not trust what a manager of safety tells you about safety in their company. But that's where the consultants go and interview. They go and interview the managers responsible, right? And they believe what they say, which is tremendously naive, right? So be growing steady, 15 or 16 companies where the management say they're good at something. You identify things that they all do in common, and then you create a recipe book, a fast-selling popular book with a set of recipe cards which say, do these things, you too will be successful. Everybody familiar with that approach? Okay, my favourite example on this is if Halifax, or rather Nova Scotia, wants to increase the number of Nobel Prizes. Have you got any, by the way? Any Nobel Prizes from... Okay. Right, so if you want to increase them, right, the key is to increase the consumption of dark chocolate per head of population. There is a direct correlation over the last 20 to 30 years of dark chocolate consumption per head of population with Nobel Prizes per head of population. So it's very simple, all right? You know what to go and do. The other one I love, by the way, is suicides by drowning directly correlate with Nicolas Cage movies. All right, but that I can actually see a causal link. All right. There's a whole site of false correlations, and they're quite incredible. All right, and the trouble is, people believe that their correlation, because it actually gives them a recipe, a set of safety, must be right, but they don't check the facts. And the trouble is, they don't really get into the context of what's going on. We've got other problems on this. So we know the way that people report events. So anybody's done a lessons learned process? Or peer assist or any of these sort of techniques. The trouble is, if people have succeeded, they remember history different than if they failed. We did controlled tests on this in IBM with outsourcing contracts. So these are mixed teams. Salesmen, engineers, marketing people. Outsourcing contracts are massive. They're $1 million budgets. It's 8 or 9 months in progress, and one day you get told whether you've won or lost. If you won, you're a hero. If you've lost, well, kind of like you'd be lucky to escape failure. So we did a big project on that. We did a lessons learning process, and I should say we now talk about lessons learning, not lessons learnt. Yeah, because you need continuous field capture of lessons at a fragmented level, and I'll come back to that later on. So we did a lesson, but this was technically lessons learned, a structured process, what's happened over the previous year. A technique called future backwards, which I'll commend to you as a method. That's an open event method, right? Puts a cognitive load on people. They have to describe history backwards, not forwards. By the way, anybody got teenage children? Okay, this is a CIA interrogation technique. I strongly commend it to you, all right? I've learned a lot over the years, and I've had teenage children, and knowing about complexity, cognitive science and interrogation techniques is really useful with teenage children, right? So if they come in at 3 o'clock in the morning, and after you've hugged them because they're still alive, you want to kill a little bastards, have anybody been there? Right? And they have this wonderful, plausible story, all right, about, mobile phone reception, having to look after a friend, and you're pretty sure they're lying. Get them to tell the story backwards. Yeah, human beings can't lie backwards consistently. We can lie forwards with alacrity, but it takes a lot of training to tell a story backwards if it isn't true. And so I share that with you because I don't believe in reincarnation, and I wouldn't have liked my parents to practice it on me, but it's a legitimate technique. Either way, so we're using an advanced technique, all right, which does actually flesh out stuff which you wouldn't otherwise get. Yeah? And we actually capture the lessons learned with the same team the day before they know the result and the day afterwards. Completely different. Yeah, so no separation longer than 48 hours. The memory is radically changed because human beings change their memory of the past to meet the political contingencies of the present. And anybody who does this, please be honest with us because we're a no-blame culture. Anybody heard that nonsense? Yeah, that's a Darwinian technique to eliminate the fatally naive early on in their career, right? The reality is that the scary thing is people don't lie, they think it's true. And I'll come back into some of the reasons for this later. So you can't trust what people say about cases anyway. Yeah. We did a body of work with the big 6 consultancy firm. We put in anthropologists to actually spend weeks looking at their use of knowledge management systems. When you heard what they said they did, consultants went on, you've all heard these knowledge management stories? A lonely consultant in a hotel in Bangkok has to do a presentation to a client the next day. Yeah, they don't know what to do, so they go onto the knowledge management system and they miraculously discover a set of slides and life, the universe and everything is wonderful. Everybody heard those stories? Yeah? Well, first of all, I very much doubt if the average male consultant from a large 6 consultancy firm was on their own in a hotel room in Bangkok anyway. I had to deal with some of these guys, right? But actually, when we looked at it, it wasn't true. People accessed the system to find out the name of somebody they could phone up and have a conversation with. Nobody looked at the raw material. Because human beings actually do human validation of written material. Yeah, and that's actually key to understand. Right? And also, we know that often it doesn't work. Yeah? For my sins, I've written 2 ISO 9001 manuals. Anybody done an 9001 manual? Yeah. Okay, so I got called in by the CEO and he said, you're in charge of getting an ISO 9001 certificate. And I said, why me? I break the rules. So, he said, poachers make the best gamekeepers. Yeah, which was kind of like, okay, you bastards, all right, but never mind. And he said, and also you'll write something that people will follow. If I give it to quality, they'll write a 15-volume set with an 8-week training program and we'll never pass it. So I wrote a manual which was 83 pages long. It used a do-case approach. I was a programmer then, well, had been a programmer. And basically it was if this happens, do this, if this happens, do this, if this happens, do this. If anything else happens, gather these people together and minute what you did. I didn't know about complexity then, but that is actually a very sensible complexity technique. As if quality had done it, they would have spent months writing it, going through multiple scenarios, and we just had a very simple process. These things we know what to do. Anything else will create a fast response process. It will document and go into a knowledge base. Then we had another book, which is the name of all the managers who had to be removed from the building if the quality inspectors came, because they couldn't be trusted to answer the questions in the appropriate way. And we were a secure site, so we could hold up quality inspections by challenging their, we basically, the security guards had an instruction, if anybody comes from an inspector, challenge their ID, we need half an hour to evacuate the building of people who don't know how to answer the questions, so then nominated deputies can take over. Either I did that, got sold to another company to do it, and it would have been a career, but I decided I'd had enough, right? Now, I'm making a series of points, all right, which actually anybody who's been around in business or government knows anyway, but we try and pretend it isn't true. Yeah, and we need to get a greater degree of authenticity into the system. Yeah? So the big problem, as I say, right, is that you can't trust what people say, the correlation causation thing, and there's a whole body of other cognitive biases I'll go through. Yeah? The reality is that you can't trust what people say about the past. Therefore, while you can learn from the past, you can't use it to create prescriptive recipes for the future in other than very restricted cases. Yeah? The other problem you've got is if you excessively focus on people not failing in an environment where failure is inevitable, and actually in most engineering cultures, actually a degree of failure is inevitable, people do not report the failure because the failure is punished, so actually you build up the potential for significant failure because it will happen catastrophically. Yeah, I always get worried when I go on a building site with all these 0 accidents for the last 6 months, because I actually know from a whole body of ethnography it means people aren't reporting early stage accidents anymore. Yeah, if they said we've had 15 near misses in the past 3 months, I'd be actually comfortable. If you don't know it, air traffic control in Christchurch, which is the most dangerous airport to land in New Zealand, by the way. I mean, Wellington, it's always fun if you land in Wellington and somebody hasn't done it before. You're perfectly safe, but the plane will sort of do this, all right, because it's not called Windy Wellington for nothing. But the wind is predictable. In Christchurch, they get massive downdrafts coming over the hills, completely unexpected. They can drop a plane 40 metres. Yeah, without warning. Yeah? So either way, in Christchurch, they actually discipline air traffic controllers who don't have one near miss a month. You remember a near miss in aviation is quite high, because they basically say if you don't get a near miss, you're not stacking the aircraft tight enough. And secondly, if you don't have a near miss any month, what will really happen if we have a major disaster? Because there's a body of practical experience to get. Yeah? Okay, so I could go through some other examples, but the key thing on this is that actually context is everything. Yes, sir. So that's the picture, right? You would think, anybody know where that is? You're not going to know, all right? Okay, that's at a beach called Port Coleman near the village of Llangwynadl on the Llyn Peninsula in Wales, right? For me and anybody in my family, that has huge significance. That is 3 weeks of every summer holiday for 20 years with my grandmother sat ensconced in cushions in there, yeah, on the way it works. Yeah? Basically, context, all human systems are context specific, not context free. Yeah, people make decisions based on history. In my family, if you come and have dinner on a Sunday and one of us says, shall we go out for a Sunday afternoon stroll, you're advised to equip yourself for survival overnight in winter conditions, all right? Now, you have to know our family to know that, but actually if you go back to your family, you've got coded words and memories which actually trigger things. And the same is true of organizations. Yeah, we actually use metaphor, stories, keywords to trigger memories which are understood in common, which determine how we respond. And some of those are general. So if a chief executive comes in and says, I want to assure you all that there will be no redundancies, everybody gets their CVs together. Because the pattern is people saying that means there will be redundancies. If somebody comes into the organisation these days and say, we've got a safety problem, we're going to have a cultural change program to make us a safer organisation, everybody sits down and says, oh my God, here we go again, what do we have to pretend to do? Because the reality is people have been through too many change programs and seen too many failures, so you're automatically triggering the memory of those failures. So understanding context is key. So let's just run through some basic stuff about knowing. Yeah? Now that's a thatch. Anybody? You don't have thatch over here, do you? Right? Yeah, I live in a thatched cottage in Wiltshire. All right, it's across the road from the pub. It's, parts of it go back to the 5th century. We've thrown on multiple extensions, and the only problem with thatch, it looks really nice. It keeps the house warm. Yeah, but every 30 or 40 years, you have to bring the thatchers in. And a good thatcher is a difference between 10 or 15 years life on the roof. So the good thatchers are booked up in advance. Right? The other problem is we're near Avebury Stone Circle. If you don't know Avebury, okay, you all know Stonehenge? Okay, that's the one we keep for American tourists because we know they'll cluster there, right? Avebury's older and far more impressive. Yeah, it's about 45 miles north of Stonehenge. So I live within walking distance of that, which means we do get tourist coaches coming down. If they know a cottage has been rethatched, the coaches divert because they want to show it, all right? And we're on the road opposite the pub down a country lane, so the coach comes down. And everybody is disturbing the thatcher, and I got really worried about my daughter then because I discovered she's making money selling tea to said coach parties, and I noticed I'm supplying the goods and getting no profit from this. Right? She doesn't like to be reminded about this. She's a bit more idealistic these days. Right? Now the problem is they talk to the thatcher, and this is a craft. It's an apprentice model. Young thatchers do a 10 or 15 year apprenticeship. Yeah, and literally the way they stack the straw can make a huge difference. Yeah, in terms of then it's an old craft. Yeah, the trouble is if they when they ask the thatcher how he does it and describes what he does, I have to take him into the house and have a beer with him and talk about football so he can forget how he does it, so he can go back and do it properly. Yeah, the reality is articulating what you do generally means you lose a lot. Yeah, one of the ways to get people to fall over is to describe the decision process they're making in moving one foot in front of the other. You can always make them fall over. Yeah? Now that leads to one of the first key things I want to talk about in terms of knowledge management, which is knowledge is contextual. Yeah? We know things when we need to know them. Human beings recall things based on stimulation. Computers recall things based on search. Yeah? If you ask a human being what they know, I used to do this from time to time, is get some executives and say, okay, there's a pen and paper, write down all you know. It was terribly cruel, all right, because after about half an hour they'd freeze. Right? Now the reality is we know what we know when we need to know it. You've all had the experience of a contextual simulation suddenly bringing back a memory from 20 or 30 years ago, yeah, which you couldn't have known until the context required it. Yeah? Now that relates to the way the human brain processes data, and it's not the same way as a computer. And the trouble is most health and safety work assumes a computer model of decision making and information processing. We assume if we put the right information in front of the right people at the right time and they have the right training and the right competences, they will make the right decisions. And that's not true unless they're autistic. Yeah? Humans who are fully autistic actually make decisions like computers. And the danger is we're building rules and regulations which reward people who are autistic but not anybody else, because compliance with linear processes produces that sort of impact. So knowledge is contextual, it requires stimulation. I'll come back to that when I talk about ritual. Secondly, we always know more than we can say. We will always say more than we can write down. The process of taking knowledge from my ability to act to my ability to speak it, to write it down, is a process of progressive and significant loss. The basic data on this is what you can write down is less than 10% of what you know. Right? So just think about that immediately in the context of any manual, any document. Yeah? I mean, if people come to you, and we used to have this in IBM, and we had a big problem on this, right? So we're working for IBM, it's a reward-orientated organization, and they said to me, you've got to write down what you know about the use of narrative, right? And so I said, okay, I'll do that. You learnt this in IBM. If somebody senior told you to do something and you didn't want to do it, you said you'd do it and you just didn't. Yeah, most problems went away, right? And it's not that I don't want to share it, but I don't want to share it with people I don't trust. It's actually not power which is the reason for retention, it's fear of abuse. If you have deep knowledge, you're generally happy to share it, but you want to control the use because then you can make sure it's used properly. So then they added my bonus to it. They realized I hadn't done it, so they said, you have to share your knowledge, otherwise you won't get your bonus. Now, by now, daughter is a teenager. Bonuses are essential to paternal relationships with teenagers, particularly teenage daughters. Yeah? So I've got to earn my bonus, but I don't want to share my knowledge, so I wrote a 15-page paper on eschatological realization, which was a fictional debate between Deleuze and Habermas, talking about the nature of epistemology using assemblage theory. And I said, well, I've shared my knowledge. Yeah, and actually my manager wasn't fussed because there was a document he could tick the box on. And nobody has ever understood it to this date, including me, because I actually wrote it after 4 glasses of good malt whiskey. Because it takes me 2 glasses of malt whiskey to open a book by Deleuze in the first place, right? If anybody knows Deleuze, you'll understand that particular need for alcoholism, right? The reality is, and what I did was actually disguise my knowledge. Yeah? If anybody looked at it, they got curious, they phoned me up, we had a conversation. Yeah? The real danger was I codified it so that people thought they understood it, because then there would have been accidents. Yeah? So there's a whole body of human knowledge which requires that sort of experience type model within it. Yeah? By the way, that's why we use a lot of narrative. If I look at the work we've done with the US Army in Afghanistan, actually the main communication mechanism is by narratives. Yeah? And I remember I did a presentation on this in the Pentagon, and I got thrown out of the Pentagon. Well, you don't get thrown out, but when people with guns indicate you should leave, you tend to go along with it, right? Because I basically said you can't codify knowledge. And the guys from TRADOC got really angry with me, right? And then 2 years later I got phoned by General Sorensen, who was a 3-star, now IT for the US Army, and he said, come back, because what we found in Iraq is nobody read doctrine, but actually platoon commanders blogged and everybody read the blogs. Yeah, and of course blogs are a narrative form. And people were spending 2 or 3 hours when they were exhausted reading blog posts, but they wouldn't spend 10 minutes reading doctrine, because that was somebody else taking the raw narrative and synthesizing it based on what they understood from the past. Yeah, and we then deployed into Afghanistan, and I'll talk about this later, in what's called narrative-based retrieval. So what we know, yeah, which we can't write down, requires an apprentice. Yeah? We can't say or we can't write down. That actually requires apprentice models of learning. And you can certify people's competence based on apprenticeship. What we can say but not write down is narrative, and what we can write down is traditional codification. Now I guarantee that for most people here, safety rules will only be one of those, not the other 2. Yeah, and the stuff which we can write down is probably the most insignificant in that way. Yeah?
So I agree broadly with the distinction you make between writing down and what we can say in narrative being important for certain types of communication. If we look at industries that are demonstratively very successful in terms of safety, aviation being an example of that, they have a lot more codification than other industries in terms of rules, procedures, and put significant effort in that way. So how does that balance in terms of...
Okay, 2 things. I'm going to come to one thing in a minute. All right? One is their primary organisational form is a crew. Right, and I want to come back to that in a minute, because a crew works in a very different way from a team. Yeah, it has a ritual trigger of cognitive activation patterns, right? And they also have very long apprentice schemes. Yeah? So that's one thing, all right? The second thing is I've done human factors design and air traffic management, so if you fly into Helsinki airport, it's my fault if it goes wrong, right? The actual primary mechanism of training of air traffic controllers is stories of how they failed. That's where most of them learn from. They all have good stories of how they failed, and they swap those around. Now there is codification, there is documentation, but the primary mechanism is, and I'll come back to ritual in a minute, all right? But the primary mechanism of learning is still narratives of failure shared by more experienced people.
Yes, so they definitely learn through experience, like all of us learn through experience, particularly skill-based learning, but they still have a large proportion, I think, of the success of aviation is the very detailed description of how to manage a wide range of...
Don't get me wrong, I'm not denying the value of what's codified. Yeah, so I'm saying that's okay, but I'm saying it's a small part of it, right? I'm also saying in aviation, The reason the codification works is because of two other significant factors. One is the use of crews, which I'm going to come back to in a minute, and the other is the long learning periods, which are heavily narrative based in the way that people share experience to realize the significance of the documentation. Yeah? The other reality you've got on this, so for example the codification and air traffic management on counter-terrorism, Singapore have got a brilliant manual on it. Yeah? Covers everything you need to do. When an aircraft got hijacked, they pulled the manual out of the safe and realised they didn't have time to read it, so they ad hoc'd.
And I think there's a distinction though between a manual not being used is unhelpful, but a manual that is helpful can be very useful.
Yes and no, all right. First of all, and let's give some more examples, all right. If you look at the Miracle on the Hudson, it was because the guy was a glider pilot, not because he followed the rules. He actually broke the rules, but he treated his plane like it was a glider. And there's 3 or 4 cases on that, right? I could go on this, all right? But fundamentally, I'm not challenging the value of documentation, but I am challenging the concept that documentation is enough.
Okay, yeah. No,
Yeah? All right? And that's a significant issue, all right? Yeah. And the other problem is an over-reliance on documentation can be deeply problematic. Because the other issue is we don't remember documents if we don't use the knowledge after a few weeks. Right? So if the knowledge isn't in active use, the memory goes away. And I'd actually argue, if you look at the work we're doing with nurses in hospitals at the moment, they are consistently breaking the rules to provide empathetic care. If I look at the work we did in the mining industry in South Africa, no diamonds would come out of the mines if people followed the rules. Yeah, it's why a work to rule is the most deadly thing anybody can do, including air traffic controllers. Yeah? So the argument is we need to reduce the dependency on codification, increase the dependency on apprentice models and narrative, and there's some other stuff I'm going to go through in a minute. Yeah? Okay, next one up on this. Anybody know about London taxi drivers?
Yeah.
Okay, well this is kind of like the classic metaphor. It's one of the ways I describe the difference between using information and using knowledge, right? And people confuse the two. One of the big problems we've got in education at the moment is it's become information regurgitation rather than knowledge creation. Yeah? So basically, let's take the difference between a map and a taxi driver. So if you've got a map of London, yeah? It's a highly symbolic, codified piece of knowledge, all right? You have to understand the conventions of mapping to use it, right? But you can navigate around London. So you can arrive in Heathrow, you can hire a car, you can navigate across London using the map, right? That's fine. Yeah? The trouble is that you've got to keep looking at the map. This is Boyd's OODA loop, if we know about that. Yeah? Observe, orientate, decide, act. So you've got to observe where you are, orientate yourself to the map, decide where you want to go. Yeah? Now that's kind of like cool, but if you get to Hyde Park Corner and we realise you're a foreigner in a hire car, there's an entertaining game that London drivers play, which is we sandwich you on the inside of the roundabout and prevent you getting off it, right? You'll actually see drivers pass, a hire car comes in, the guy obviously doesn't know what he's doing, so kind of like we just pass them on. They have to go around about 50 times before somebody feels sorry for them, right? You're going to be slow. If you've got any sense, every now and then you'll stop the car. In fact, even with a sat-nav, it can get very difficult if you don't know the area. Yeah, we'll come back to sat-navs in a second. So that's fine, right? The fastest way of getting there is to get into a black cab. Now, the black cab, you can get into it and you can say, there's a hotel called something or other, it's somewhere near the exhibition centre in the Dockland, and the guy will know what you're talking about. You can fall asleep in the car, you can change clothes in the car, in the taxi. I've done that before now when I've got a conference speech to give, yeah? And you can have complete confidence you'll arrive at the right space, and the taxi driver will get there far faster than anybody navigating with a map. Okay? Now, one of the reasons for that is the way we train taxi drivers in London, and we have this weird concept that taxi drivers should be trained, is they spend a minimum of 2.5 years. Nobody is qualified in less than 2.5 years. Yeah? And they drive around the streets of London on a small motor scooter with a map of London strapped to the handlebar till they know the name of every street. And the exam is to be given any 2 points in London and describe the route out turn by turn and the route back turn by turn. So it's got harder since the one-way system, mentioning every major hotel and landmark on the route. Yeah, it has a 40% pass rate over multiple attempts. Yeah? And the interesting thing is the hippocampus of a London taxi driver is significantly enlarged compared with other human beings. This was one of the first bits of research where we realized that certain aspects of knowledge require physical restructuring of the brain. Yeah? And actually we know far more about that now. Yeah, there's a whole body of knowledge which always is going to take you a minimum of 2 years to acquire, because the body and the brain have to make significant physical changes. Yeah? So the taxi driver is always going to be faster than the map user. Yeah? Now the advantage of maps is that you don't need the investment of taxi drivers. Yeah, I can pick up a map, I can get anywhere, that's not a problem. But that can be dangerous. Yeah? So remember the first time I went to New York, right, and I'm Welsh, right, so if you don't know, we sing at rugby matches, right, we don't chant, we sing. So I live equidistant between Cardiff Arms Park and the Royal Opera House, right? And I oscillate between the two. In fact, you can work out where I am in the world by Wagner Ring Cycles or Wales on tour, right? I can manage my life around that. Anyway, so I get to New York, right, and you know the Welsh instinct is, okay, you said you haven't been there before, where's the rugby ground, where's the Opera House, right? Now they don't have a rugby ground because, if you don't know, American football started when Harvard and Yale decided rugby was too rough, right? So they wanted padding, right? That's the origins of American football. But they do have a reasonably competent opera house. I mean, I should say that having been there many times, the audience show more evidence of knowledge of plastic surgery than of opera. Yeah, and they do like their Italian opera, and you can't get away from it. But I want to go to the Met, all right? So I'm staying, you need to know the geography now of Tarrytown. So I'm staying in Tarrytown, which is up the Hudson Valley from New York. If anybody knows that? Okay, it's IBM land, all right? The population is now actually genetically engineered because it's been interbreeding between Reader's Digest and IBM for the past 3 generations, all right, with all sorts of consequences. Right? So I'm staying in Tarrytown. If I get the tickets for the Met, and they're a lot cheaper than I thought they'd be. So I actually get good seats. I mean, I pay that for the amphitheatre in London. I'm paying it for front row seats virtually in the Met, right? Now, if I was in the Royal, I'd have to wear a dinner jacket. So I take my dinner jacket, I stay in the Hilton Tarrytown. I've got to work in IBM that day, so I go into IBM wearing the dinner jacket. I get laughed at all day, right? Going on the Hudson Valley line, right? Later on, I go north on the Red Line. Because that gets me to the Lincoln Center. Wonderful performance of Trovatore, but I realise I'm the only person in the entire opera house in a dinner jacket, so I actually become a significant additional attraction with half time. Sorry, the interval. We tend to get rugby and opera confused, right? So at the end of the opera, I come out, and I realise that the next train from Tarrytown is going in 10 minutes. Okay? Now, if you know New York, you know you can't do Lincoln Center, Grand Central Station in 10 minutes. And I don't want to hang around Grand Central for an hour and a half for the next train. So I look at the map. Remember these information knowledge assets? Yeah, map's wonderfully reliable, isn't it? And I'm on the Red Line. And I remember when we came in from Tarrytown, we stopped at 125th Street before we went to Grand Central. And I see that the Red Line also stops at 125th Street. And the distance between the subway station and the Overland station is only 3 blocks. So I reckon I can jump on this train, get off at 125th Street, walk across 2 blocks, pick up the train going north. And just to say, this is in the 1980s, right? Now, if you don't know New York, if I tell this story in New York, by now they're looking at me with an expression of complete horror, right? Getting off at 125th Street, approaching midnight with a white skin, a dinner jacket, with an expensive IBM computer slung over your shoulder is, shall we say, a hazardous enterprise, right? So I'm walking down the street because, I've been around long enough, I know I've got to walk confidently, all right? And, there are people starting to surround me, right? And, it's kind of like scary, all right? It's kind of like, it's a matter of when it will happen, right? And NYPD, thank God, pulled up, all right? And the guy said, buddy, what the fuck are you doing here, all right? It was kind of like, you're about to create major problems for me, all right? So I get bundled into the car, taken down to Grand Central. Yeah, turns out his wife is cousin to somebody who I know in Merthyr Tydfil, but never mind, this is the way the world is connected. Yeah, and I tell the story the next day. I'm still shaking, all right, because I mean, you shouldn't do this, all right? I mean, it's now, by the way, completely safe. It's become terribly gentrified, and you can walk around without a problem. Yeah, but then it was scary, right? So I go to IBM the next day and I tell this story. It's now the story of the mad Welshman on 125th Street. And they said, didn't you know you shouldn't do that? And I said, the map doesn't say here be muggers and other strange beasts. The map says if I get off here and walk across there. And they said, but everybody knows that. Yeah? Now this is the big problem again with codification. To codify, you have to make so much assumption about what other people know that the danger is you get it wrong. Okay, I'm spending some time on this because I want to build the reasons for the solution. Yeah? The other thing, if you don't know it, and this is probably one of the two most significant things coming out of the biology of the brain, is consciousness is not co-located with the brain. It's a distributed function of the brain and the body. Yeah? So when you pull your hand away from a hot plate, if anybody's done that, your brain doesn't fire until after you've done it. Yeah, people like Richard Dawkins say this means you don't have free will, but the trouble with Richard Dawkins is he's a Calvinist in atheist disguise. Right? And if you actually assume that the brain has to make all the decisions, that's a linear causal model, yeah, then the fact the brain fires after you've done something leads you to that sort of conclusion. The fact is this is actually called autonomic processing, what Kleiderman called thinking fast. Yeah? Basically what happens is the body develops and evolves the capacity to make decisions instinctively. The brain is firing after the event to validate whether it was right this time or not so it can correct it. Yeah? Now once you realise that, a whole set of problems go away. And by the way, this is the true difference between the right and left side of the brain. It's one of several. The idea one is emotional and one is logical is just a management consultant nonsense, all right? And that one where you look at the spiraling dancer and decide whether you're... It's up there with Myers-Briggs in terms of pseudoscience, right? So either way, I did say I wasn't going to take hostages, didn't I? So basically what actually happens is that the left side of the brain is literally handling 20 million items per second. If that doesn't work, so the model starts to fail, the right side of the brain clicks in, that handles 20,000 items per second and consumes a huge amount of energy, which is why you don't do it unless you've really got to. Yeah, evolution is about energy minimization. So as long as the automatic process produces an acceptable result, you won't flick into novelty receptive process. Right? And that's actually one of the reasons why people walk into walls and make major accidents, because they're only scanning a limited amount of data. And that training process takes 2 or 3 years. Now the scary thing on this is if you ever have a relative with brain injury, sorry, we have a black sense of humour in Wales, right? If you have a relative with brain injury, you can make an absolute fortune by selling your relative as a research subject to cognitive neuroscientists. I mean, they hang around hospitals waiting for people to come in with brain injuries, and they really want somebody to come in with a steel shaft driven through their upper cortex so they can replicate the Phineas Gage experiment, with modern equipment, right? So a woman came in, she'd lost most of the right side of her head, including the right side of her brain, her arm in a tragic road accident, and she survived. It's amazing what some people survive, whereas a pinprick can kill you. So either way, she survived, but she didn't have novelty receptive processing left. So they asked her to pick up a tray of glasses full of water. She thought she still had a right hand. Now she's got all the stimulation, but she hasn't got the capacity to process it. So she thinks she picked up the tray, but of course she picks it up with one hand, it spills water all over her. She accuses them of throwing water at her. It wasn't till they electrically stimulated the small remnant of her right brain she realised she'd lost her arm. Now that is actually a key thing to understand, not just about humans, but about organisations. If you get stable patterns that work, we don't flip into novelty receptive mode until everything fails, by which time it's too late. Yeah? And again, that's the other problem with traditional approaches to safety, is we only trigger a recognition that we need to change when it's almost too late to change, which is where the weak signal detection comes from. Yeah? So that post-Cartesian concept is key. Next one is we learn more from failure than we learn from success. Yeah? What stories spread naturally around organisations? Stories of failure or stories of success? Yeah? If you're telling stories to your kids, how many people read stories to their kids at night? Yeah. Do you do the story of how Bob and Betsy stayed at home and did what Mummy and Daddy said so the world was a better place? Or do you do Bob and Betsy went into the wild wood, almost got eaten by the witch, the wolves, or whatever is around, all right? But we make sure we have a happy ending. Right? All human storytelling traditions tell stories of failure, not stories of success. Yeah, the human brain assimilates failure almost instantly. It doesn't always assimilate success. And the evolutionary reasons, avoidance of failure is a more successful evolutionary strategy than imitation of success. We now build worst practice systems rather than best practice systems, because people learn more from worst practice systems than they do from best practice systems. I'm going to show you some results from work we've been doing in aircraft manufacture, where actually the story that everybody tells isn't I clipped my harness, my safety harness on so I didn't fall off the gantry. The one everybody knows is I didn't clip my harness on, I fell off the gantry, luckily Fred was underneath me, he broke a leg but I was still alive. Everybody will tell you that story, including the one of the guy who actually barrel rolled a jumbo jet under San Francisco Bridge, which is quite an interesting one, right? They have some really interesting test pilots, right? But the point is, all right, you find this in all organisations. The way organisations learn is by experienced people sharing stories with other people of how they failed. Yeah? Now that's the reality of the way we evolved to learn, but our systems don't reflect it. In fact, we're really cynical about best practice stories. It's kind of like we know that people have assimilated and written them to make a point, and we know that the world never quite works like that. Yeah? Right? So actually building worst practice systems can actually be a more successful learning mechanism. Yeah? We've got a couple of things we do on this. I mentioned cruisers, so let's talk about this. If you look at an aircraft cockpit, or if you go into air traffic management, the process of coming on shift is highly ritualised. You'll notice most people in crews wear uniform as well. So the pilot is going through a checklist. The checklist is extremely useful, but the checklist has another function. It does what's called cognitive activation. It moves them from being whoever they are to being a pilot. What it does is it aligns identity with role. Yeah? And there's a long training process in that, but it means you can have a crew with people who haven't worked together before, but they're trained in role and role expectation and the interactions between roles. We see the same in operating theatres in hospitals, emergency fire crews. Yeah? Basically, a crew is an extremely successful method of embedding knowledge in a collective unit. Yeah? And it's the ritual activation of a trained pattern which works. And of course, you have to constantly train. I do a lot of work with the US Army and elsewhere. The Army trains to fail. All training is designed to get people to fail, because the more you train, the safer you are when you work operationally. Yeah, and nobody would allow it to be manual. They're also finding some interesting data, by the way. Young kids who are good at computer games are absolutely crap at making decisions in the field. Yeah, because the physical simulation and the stress radically changes it from computer-based simulation. Now, based on that, one of the techniques we use a lot is called anthro-simulation. So this is where we set up a situation where whatever people do, they fail. I grew up on Star Trek as a young child, so you can know where I got this idea from, right? Basically, what we have, 3 teams working together. Yeah? So let's take I won't do a physical one, that takes longer to describe, right? 3 teams working together, they have to describe a situation, and we're constantly feeding them data while they're doing the description, because that's reality. In reality, you're constantly facing new information. Yeah? At one point in time, they have to say, okay, this is what the situation is, this is what we'll do. Then we send them away for a couple of hours. When they come back, whatever they did turns out to have been a total disaster. Now, this is quite easy for the games team to assemble, because you can actually find something they missed. Yeah, you can then build a realistic scenario based on something they missed. And they come back and they say, oh my God, we missed that, and we move them through that cycle 3 times. By the end of it, they realise they're doomed. Okay? Now the interesting thing is, after 3 rounds of failure, typically they're scanning 20 to 30 times more data before they make a decision. Yeah? And actually, when people succeed, they tend to reflect badly out of a training exercise. Yeah? The other thing we're doing is we're constantly capturing their narrative of why they made decisions and how they think when they failed, and that goes into a database which is available for live operations. So using training simulations to generate multiple stories of potential failure and solutions gives you much more realistic codified material than trying to write it down in advance in a structured document. Yeah, I'll talk about this later, but narrative is best accessed by ambiguous questions arising in ambiguous discovery. Yeah? One of the ways we make decisions, by the way, is called conceptual blending. So a human being will look at a data set, yeah? They'll pick up a partial data set, that will trigger half-remembered memories from their past or from training or from documents. Now they may occasionally look at a document as well, then they blend all those fragments together to come up with a unique form of action. Yeah? Now that's actually why we hold knowledge these days at a very fragmented level, because the human brain evolved to put together fragments, not to put together results of structured documents. Yeah, and say that's what we found with the army and elsewhere. Yeah? So again, I'm trying to build the science on this so you get some of the background. And then finally on this, all right, a body of knowledge is an evolutionary process as much as it's a database. Yeah? You actually need, and some of the work we're now doing, for example, is safety manuals actually become constantly involved in fragmented documents rather than stuff with structured release. Now I say that with some qualification, right? Anybody remember company handbooks? Okay, I mean, when I first became a manager, you got this, all right? So it was a ring binder, yeah, and it all looked perfect, and then 6 months later you get this pack would come cellophane wrapped, and it would be things like replace page 15 with pages 15A to J. Yeah? On page 88, replace or with and. I always used to love those, all right? And you sit at home at night and you go through that. Okay, there's enough memory on this, right? Turns out that's a better cognitive process than having it all on the internet. Because basically you're ritualizing the process of assimilating change. So whereas a computer will always look up things from scratch, a human being always works on memory of the last time they read something. Yeah, so I'd say with some qualification on the real-time things, some things need to be ritualized in terms of the absorption of change. Right? So again, there's a lot of practice we can go back to. Okay, so now kind of like the killer punch and all of this. This is from a book which was written by a bunch of cognitive neuroscientists to deal with Malcolm Gladwell's Blink, right? Do not say to any cognitive neuroscience that you've taken Blink seriously. You will not be invited round for dinner, right? It's a classic example of a journalist with a thesis discovering the aspects of cases which match the thesis and ignoring those which don't, right? There's actually a Malcolm Gladwell book generator, if you look at it online, which generates the book covers with the titles. It's quite clever, really. His first book was actually quite good. A bit like Taleb's first book was quite good, but then they get carried away. So this has been performed many times. We don't know why radiologists have offended the cognitive neuroscience community, but at some stage in past they've done something really bad, and the whole community is out to get revenge. In fact, nobody really knows why they're doing it anymore. It's just ritual. Right? So you take now remember, a radiologist, all right, on average has got 10 or 15 years experience with extensive training. You're giving them x-rays which are much more limited information than you normally get in a safety environment. Yeah? And you basically take a batch of x-rays, on one of them you put a picture of a gorilla in plain sight. There's reasons for that if you know your history. Yeah? Actually, the scary thing on this is 83% don't see it. Their eyes scan it, but they don't see it. Yeah? And the 17% who do come to believe they were wrong when they talk with the other 83%. Right? Now that actually has major implications. Now the reason this happens is the most you scan if you're in this room, all right, most people here from a Caucasian background of some type, is about 5% of what's available to you. If you're Chinese, it goes up to 10%. is actually the evolutionary pressure of pictorial languages has produced a higher scanning ratio. Better focus on context, not on content. There's pluses and minuses on this. If you give Chinese students a picture of a tiger drinking from a stream in the forest, they'll see the forest and miss the tiger, whereas American students will see the tiger and miss the forest. The difference actually accounts for differences in foreign policy as well, by the way. But it's a context object focus. Either way, for everyone in this room, 5% is the most you'll see. You then match that against stored patterns. Remember conceptual blending? Radiologists have somewhere in the region of 20 to 40,000 stored patterns in their brain, their body and their tools. Don't underestimate the value of tools and processes in this. It's what Andy Clark called scaffolding. Right? So basically they've got that many patterns, and the most frequently used ones get stimulated first. So they don't do a best fit pattern match, they do a first fit pattern match. So based on a partial data scan, they do a first fit pattern match, and that's how they make decisions. And that's why they don't see it. It's called inattentional blindness. Now again, this can be quite scary. My father was a veterinary surgeon. That was why I did theoretical physics and philosophy at university. If you're forced to do sheath washings on bull, being laughed at by Welsh farmers in a cold January morning at puberty, you decide I'm never going to go down that career route. Right? Either way, when I was 14, he got a medal because he spotted rabies in a dog one day before it was going to be released from a containment centre. And we have a policy in the UK, if you don't know it, on animal disease, which is called slaughter. Yeah, we're in Ireland, so we do that. Right? I used to make a lot of pocket money. Foot and mouth outbreaks were wonderful because I can make pocket money killing pigs. All right? But either way, so rabies is quite scary. Right? We haven't had rabies for ages. He spotted it. It was manifesting in a non-typical way. So the normal process hadn't seen it. Now he got a medal because he saved a fortune. Our policy, if we get a rabies outbreak, is every mammal within 1 mile radius is slaughtered. Yeah? Human beings are exempt from that. The vets don't really agree with that. They think it's bad strategy. Right? So this is a huge event. Dad's won a prize, all right? So, how did you do it? And he said, well, first of all, he said, I've seen rabies. He was in the Royal Army Veterinary Corps in the Second World War. He served in Afghanistan and Egypt, so he saw a lot of rabies. He said, very few British vets have actually seen it. They just know about it. Yeah? He said, but I wouldn't have spotted it if I hadn't been telling you the story of the rabid jackal hunt the night before. So it was on my mind when I went into the centre. Now when we look at all the work we've done on major accidents, all the work we've done on counter-terrorism, it was on my mind, so I spotted it, is a very frequent statement. Yeah? Now again, the evolutionary reason for this is key. Think about the early hominoids on the savannas of Africa. Something large and yellow with very sharp teeth runs towards you at high speed. Do you want to autistically scan all available data, look at a catalogue of the flora and fauna of the African veldt, and having identified lion, look at best practice case studies on how to avoid getting eaten by lions? Yeah? If you actually follow that process, the only document of any use to you will be the book of Jonah from the Old Testament, which is the only example I've found of how to escape from the digestive tract of a large carnivore written by a survivor. Right? And I still remember when I picked the bear spray for the first time above Lake Louise, because I could hear bears and it said wait till the bear is 1 metre away from you before spraying it, and I thought, oh shit, right? Quite literally almost, if the bear had come. Right? Now you see the point I'm trying to make here, right? We evolved to make decisions very, very quickly based on a partial data scan, privilege in our most recent experience. Okay, now the lesson of all of this is we need to address safety on the basis of how we evolved to be as a species, not on the basis on how you would program a computer. Yeah? The trouble is, for the last 20 or 30 years, we've used a computer model of information processing to describe human decision making. Yeah, and that's coupled with the engineering metaphor, so we need to change. Yeah? Okay, so ritual I've talked about, right? If I look, and I'm now going to start to go through some examples, then we'll open up for discussion. Right? We got a project in New Zealand. It was rather interesting actually. When I was working in IBM, we were looking on a new model of doing management consultancy. I failed to persuade Ginny Rometty, but I had 4 years where they let me experiment in New Zealand and South Africa, because IBM doesn't regard New Zealand and South Africa as countries. They're that insignificant, right? So making a Welshman who loves wine spend all his time in 2 first-tier rugby player nations with vineyards, all right? I had to sit there saying, please don't throw me into the briar patch if you know your American stories, all right? Please don't do this. All right? Either way, we got a contract came in, and it was off-road safety in New Zealand. So I thought, off-road safety in New Zealand, Lord of the Rings territory, this is going to be wonderful, I'm doing that, right? I didn't know what it actually meant was Wellington Harbour at 6 o'clock on a winter's morning. Anybody's been to Wellington? Okay, you think it's cold up here? You should be in Wellington Harbour, right? The hail is coming in horizontally from the Antarctic with nothing to stop it, right? And what they meant by off-road safety is when the lorry stops driving. Then actually they had a lot of accidents in the immediate period aftermath. Okay, so the approach we adopted on that, I'm going to describe this in more detail in a minute or two, is we put students from the local college into the lorries to follow around the lorry drivers for 3 weeks as field ethnographers. 1 hour training, bunch of students, you follow the lorry driver around, and the instruction was very simple. You capture narrative from the lorry driver as the lorry driver drives. The lorry driver can refuse to give you narrative, so you've got to win their trust. And to the lorry driver, you can do anything legal with this person in terms of making them an assistant. We thought we'd better put in legal qualifications so they can help you with your job. Now, of course, working together for 1 or 2 days, they were all okay. We had virtually no cases where they refused it. Now, what we found in the narrative pattern, this is very different, by putting an ethnographer in to follow people as they do their work. You discover things that you would not discover by interviewing people, because you're closer to reality. I'll give you one more story on this in a second. So we found that one of the first things we found is that amphetamine use was 3 times what we thought it was. And we discovered it was directly linked to the excessive use of tachographs. You know what a tachograph is? Okay, it's a device in the lorry which measures how long you've driven for. Now, for various reasons in that context, you might get to within 20 minutes of home in a comfortable bed, but the tachograph would say you had to stop driving. And as a result of which people were tired, as a result of which they were taking amphetamines. There were some other complex things on that, but actually it turned out, and we've just done a lot of work in Newcastle on this with blue light services, police and fire officers. We discovered the main reason for mental breakdown is the health and safety rules, not the job. It's the excessive constraint to the health and safety rules and the consequences of failure which are causing mental breakdown. It's not the job itself. And that's actually 1 month old as a project. This is several years old. So anyway, if you're police firearms in the UK, all right, and these are very mature individuals, if they shoot somebody, and that's what they're there to do, then they get sent away for their team, while the thing is investigated and not allowed to talk to anybody. So from a tight-knit, highly dynamic community, they're put into huge socialisation with a sense of guilt, and it can take a year. But the other scary one, a fire service, all right, there's a fire officer. I remember sitting with him. I haven't put my hand around a strange man for a long time and hugged him, but he needed it, all right. And I went to talk about a story he told, right. And basically, they arrived at a frozen lake. There was a kid with his dog, right, in the lake. All right, and you know what ice is like on that, well, you know here, right? And they had to do a safety assessment before they could try and rescue him, and it basically said they didn't have the right equipment. So they called the new equipment out, and the kid died. And he basically said, and the point is they rescued the dog, but not the kid, right? And he basically, he's saying is, I should have broken the rules, and he couldn't live with himself. He had 2 suicide attempts thereafter, right? And the point is, you have to break the rules sometimes to get the job done, but the system didn't allow that, right? I've just given you 2 examples, but there were several. Right? Either way, what we did with the lorry drivers was fairly simple. We worked out what was happening, because the other big conclusion we got is when we actually got the real data on accidents, because with ethnography you get closer to real data, is most accidents, 80-something% were happening in the first 10 to 15 minutes after the lorry arrived at the harbour. So the lorry would arrive at the harbour, the guy would get out of the, go to the back, lower the thing, and he'd start to unload it. That was when the accidents happened. Now, we now had a reasonable data, we had a reasonable hypothesis. What's actually happening, his brain and body are orientated around driving. He's been driving for 200 or 300 miles. And actually, it takes the brain or body about half an hour to reset in normal circumstances. So after about 15-20 minutes, they start to rethink they're like they're a loader. So what we did is we gave them heated belts. We basically said, you've got a strap on, the belts with the pads in it that you put into the lighter socket? Yeah? So basically, you can't unload your lorry till you strap on your belt. Right? So we created a simple rule and a simple ritual, and it was physical because those belts are like weightlifter belts. So when you strap them on, they actually stiffen you up anyway. And we halved accidents. Yeah? Now what it was doing, we weren't having health and safety regulations and rules, we were using ritual to trigger a change in pattern, and of course we associated strapping on the belt with training in how to lift properly.
So Dave, not necessarily from a biomechanics perspective what that belt was doing.
It was cognitive as well. Yeah, it was a ritual. Yeah. Another example on this, we were doing work on safety in the North Sea. Yeah. So we had a big problem on the rigs, all right, with people spilling liquids. Now just to be clear, the liquids are liquid nitrogen. Right, so you know what liquid nitrogen does if it spills, particularly on your hand, all right? I mean, it just crumples, right? Now, one of the ways we needed to do that was to change attitude. This is me going further back. So what we did on this, and it was one of the most enjoyable projects I've ever run, all right? Because what we actually did is we ran ridiculously trivial health and safety campaigns in head office. Because we knew everybody cycled through head office every 2 to 3 weeks. The best one we did was the coffee safety campaign. So we had posters made with the slogan "Coffee Kills," right? With pictures of people with skin peeling off their heads, all right, after they'd been scalded with hot coffee. Yeah? We brought in company-approved coffee cups with company-approved coffee trays. Now, this is actually quite good design. They're trays designed so you can only hold them with 2 hands. You can't hold them with 1 hand. Yeah, it's good design, right? And the idea is we're going to run this program and get people really fed up, right? And then we were in the Niblick the night before. If anybody knows the Niblick in St Andrews? Okay, they have every malt whisky ever produced in Scotland, and they keep a record of which one you've drunk, right? Because you'll need it after about an hour anyway. Right? So in the course of this, we came up with a really bright idea, and we went to find the Jobsworths the next day. You know the British phrase Jobsworth? Okay, it comes from a famous song, "It's more than my job's worth." You know the really petty-minded person who don't do the sensible thing? Well, that's called a job's worth in British slang. So we asked around for the job's worth, and we were told we very quickly got them. We pulled them into a room and we made them coffee safety wardens, and we gave them armbands with pictures of coffee cups on it. Petty-minded bureaucrats love this sort of stuff. We made them responsible for enforcing coffee safety discipline. And they were so petty, they'd hide behind doors and leap out to catch people carrying coffee illegally. They caused more accidents than they presented. Everybody was furious, but when they went on the rigs, they worried about dropping liquids. You know, what we did was to train a pattern response in a safe environment rather than train it in the real environment. Yeah? So another basic rule of humans, you train best in an indirect, fault-tolerant environment, not in a tolerant one. Yeah. So as I'm going through this to make the point, right, heuristics are also key. Part of the problem with rules is that rules don't cover all possible circumstances. So a personal story that I through the background. I've mentioned my daughter several times. She's now working for me, right? So she's now this high and charming, apart from the criticism she's writing of my misuse of Deleuze, all right? I'm not enjoying that, but there's family discussions going on about it. This story is when she was this high and very charming. There's a period between the this high and this high I really want to forget about, all right? But either way. So I take her up to the top of Conwy Castle in North Wales, right? And I've got her on reins because the previous week she's almost run off the Irish ferry, all right? So I've got her now strapped with a rein, with a harness, and I got one of those extendable dog leads attached to it, which I make sure my wife doesn't see because she doesn't approve of this, but I think it's eminently practical, right? It means I can let her run off and I can reel her in, all right, if it gets dangerous, right? So we climb up to the top of the castle. Her mother and Hugh, who's 3 years younger than her are sort of, downstairs, down there looking up, right? My wife has a fear of heights, so she's not going to come up. So we get to the top, and we're leaning over the thing. We've been a bit naughty, to be honest. I'm holding onto the reins like this, and we're both leaning over to wave, all right? We shouldn't have done that. It was a father-daughter thing, right? But she drops her toy rabbit. Yeah, this is one of these fluffy toy rabbits. Falls down 20 meters and lands on a ledge. Now this is the rabbit without which we cannot sleep at night. You know those rabbits? Yeah. Now this justifies any amount of rule breaking by a father who is in no way responsible for this, but will be highly held. I'll be the one getting up at midnight. And given the way my family remembers stories, on my deathbed they'll remind me of this, all right, the day I lost Lisa. So I can't cope with this, right? And my hobby then was climbing, which I'm now back to. Right? So from a climber's point of view, a castle wall is nothing. It's vertical. It's got lots of handholds. I mean, most of the time you're hanging by one finger, right? So I tie her to the flagpole with the reins. Well, this is sensible precaution, right? Go over the wall, climb down 20 meters, collect the rabbit, climb back up, yeah? Hand over the rabbit, yeah? Get a big hug, which is always nice, all right? Carry her down, right? To be met by the entire Conwy police force, there's only 3 of them, who finally got something to do something, all right? And get hauled into the police station for having broken the rules. Difficult interview for 20 minutes till they realise what I'd done, and their fathers too. So then Eleanor gets completely spoilt for the next hour while we swap father-daughter stories, and it's all okay. Right? Now when I went over the wall, I knew I was breaking the rules. Yeah, which meant I was paying attention. And if I was paying attention far more than if I was following the rules. And as I went down, I suddenly found myself repeating a heuristic I'd learned when I first learnt to climb on the Idwal slabs. 3 points of contact, 3 points of contact, 3 points of contact. It was drummed into me for the age of 11. You don't move one limb till the other 3 are secure. Now, of course, as you become more experienced, sometimes you're moving 2 fingers, right? But basically, I was never safer because I knew I was breaking the rules. I was following a heuristic. Yeah? Now, the trouble is, if rule breaking becomes habitual, that's where you get more accidents because it's not exceptional. And I say the work we now do in aerospace is to create a rule about when the rules can be broken and heuristics that apply on the other side of the boundary. Now, this has been long known in military work, by the way. The US Marines, this is work Klein did, I followed through on. If the battlefield plan breaks down, capture the high ground, stay in touch, keep moving. And a lot of our health and safety work now is to identify the heuristics which occur in the stories of experienced engineers and codify those and attach them to teaching stories. And the principle is, if you have to break the rules under these circumstances, it's okay to break them, but now you have to follow these heuristics. If you fail following the heuristics, it's not your fault. If you don't follow the heuristics and fail, it is your fault. Yeah, because heuristics carry that sort of embedded learning. Right? And again, that's building on how things are rather than how we'd like to be. Okay, I'm going to stop there for a second, all right? Because what I've been talking so far about is the cognitive side of this. Yeah? And I've already started to throw some examples in of the sort of things we do. And it's all based on what is actually a natural, in philosophy it's called naturalizing epistemology, but it's also a realist approach. It's basically saying, how do human beings actually make decisions? Right, let's build systems based on that, not how we'd like them to do decisions. Right? What I'm going to go on from this is complexity in mapping and audits. All right? But before I do that, 5-minute break for coffee, then we'll come back for questions, all right, or for the toilet break, so 5 minutes. Yeah, and I'll open up for questions after this. Okay, guys? Now, we've got half an hour left, but I'll just stop briefly now. Any questions on what I've done so far? Because after this, I'm going to go into a sense-making framework and how you map attitudes to safety and how you intervene. Yeah? Any more? Yeah.
Just a comment/question. In my role, a lot of, I'm the CEO of workers' compensation, so what we have in this province is a relatively small number of large employers who have the majority of the workforce. So there's a leverage point there, and what we focus on is getting them to care about safety. Rather than check off the box or not even know how many injuries they're having, they look at it as a line item on their expense sheet. Now we want them to actually say we need to create safe work environments, and it's a priority. So we go hard at those leaders to try to get them engaged, to care about safety. So I'm wondering how that fits in.
I'm going to come on to that in a minute. I'm going to talk about how you map the reality of what's going on and how you change it.
Right.
And some of that is how government changes what they do as well as industry. That's called fractal decision making, which I'm going to finish off on. Yeah? One of the key principles of complexity, which is what my next subject is, you make a decision based at your own level of competence to make change. You never say what other people should do. Yeah? So I'm going to come on to that in a minute. Any more? Yeah?
So a lot of what we were talking about before in terms of decision making is, based on the sort of naturalistic decision making of Gary Klein and Salas and his colleagues, and that I think works in a context where our expectations of positive outcomes are relatively low. So when you talk about firefighters or fire ground commanders or a lot of their early work, and we did this in the offshore oil and gas industry in the UK as well, that in an emergency response context, naturalistic decision making is helpful to describe how experts make decisions. When you then apply it to a context where we expect much better performance outcomes, say healthcare, so when you apply naturalistic decision making to physicians, it does describe how they make decisions, but in terms of improving performance outcomes, it tends not to be a great model. You need to look at it in a slightly different way, and that's, I think that's the challenge. Naturalistic decision making describes how experts make decisions, but in terms of performance, sometimes it's not the best decision making.
I think I'm going to give Gary a ring after that and say somebody else agrees with me. Now listen, right? I'm not advocating naturalistic decision theory. I mean, I work with Gary a lot, right? He's a really good friend, right? Just dragged his wife up a mountain, right? From my point of view, I think what we've now got on the cognitive science point of view is an explanation of what Gary discovered empirically, which we can generalize more from. Yeah? So I think you look, what Gary is doing is observational data from which he draws conclusions. He's in that tradition. Yeah? We're coming from a natural science tradition in which you start with what natural science has and you test against those constraints. Right? So I think that's where we're coming from. So I quite agree, context of emergency is very different from context of day-to-day. I'm going to show you that in a minute on a slide, right? In terms of what you can expect. Right? And I think the trouble, the disagreement I got with Gary is that he thinks he can train people not to do things that I don't think you can. Yeah, so the whole cognitive training stuff that they run as a consultancy group, I think has a limited impact as opposed to changing the system around in which people are operating. But he and I debate that frequently.
Yeah, and say Pat Crosscarry here locally again would again advocate that in emergency room physicians, that's what his work is, to say that you need to understand that decision-making strategy, but ultimately you need to put in forcing functions that limit the likelihood that you're going to...
They do, but the problem with, and I often, one of the things I used yesterday is actually surgery as an example of this, yeah? In that you have enforcing restrictions like checking the number of surgical instruments left at the end of an operation, and that's actually hugely important because otherwise that gets neglected. But it's only possible in those environments because of the heavy training and heavy investment. It doesn't work when you move it into day-to-day operations because you haven't got the same investment in training, so you've got to do something different. Yeah. So I say my issue with Gary is I think the cases he studies are context specific, therefore you can't generalize, and that's where we're working and other people are working. But the game I meant, the multiple failure thing, that I developed with Klein in Singapore. Okay, so what I'm going to do briefly now is to deal with one of the core sciences we're working with, which is complexity science. Now I haven't got time to go into this in depth, but I'll make a statement. Systems thinking came in the 1980s, yeah? And it started to displace scientific management, which was the current dominant paradigm up to that time. I did a lot of leadership training with Peter Drucker when he was alive. One of the conclusions we came to, I got ritually humiliated first, all right? I made the mistake of criticizing Frederick Taylor and the Hotel Dell at a major conference, and Drucker was the next keynote, and if you've ever been taken apart by a 96-year-old genius, yeah, I was a puddle of humiliation in the corner of the stage, but he decided I might be retrievable and took me out for dinner, right? Anyway, after that we taught leadership together, which saved me in IBM a couple of times. They'd never had somebody work with Drucker. It's a good story actually. There was a group who were trying to have me fired, and Gerstner had just got a brochure with my picture and Drucker's picture on the front as an individual invitation to CEOs to come to a workshop. And he'd written a post-it note with, "Who is this? They work for IBM, I need to meet them." And half an hour later, 3 people came in with faked evidence to have me fired. And it was a major mistake on their part, all right? Normally it would have worked, but it didn't work on that occasion. So you learn these things, all right? But one of the conclusions we came to is that actually complexity thinking, which is a radically different thing from systems thinking. The reason is complexity deals with systems which don't have linear causality. Which means statements about the future are dangerous, but statements about the present become more important. Now that's a major paradigm shift. The conclusion Drucker and I came to is complexity theory has more in common with scientific management than either do with systems thinking. Because both recognize the criticality of apprentice models of learning and human judgment. Yeah, that they go for augmentation of that, but they do it differently. If you look at what's happened with the engineering disciplines, they've tried to remove human judgment into processes and spreadsheets. So the concept of ambiguity is critical to complexity and critical to ecosystems and critical to scientific management. Engineering approaches don't like ambiguity. Yeah, they try and eliminate it. Right? So please don't confuse complexity theory with systems thinking. It's actually different. Yeah? This is from Brian Arthur, who was the first person to introduce complexity science to economics. He lost tenure at Stanford over this. Well, do something radically useful, and economists are never going to like it, right? If you haven't read it yet, read Donut Economics by Kate Ramuth, who's a friend. I mean, they're a group of economists who, when they were students, they basically said economics is based on entirely false premises, it's not a science. And a few of us said to them, yeah, but you've got to prove yourself before you can criticize it. So they all got PhDs in economics. Now they've written Donut Economics, which is a devastating criticism of neoclassical economics. And basically says in the way that the ecosystem and the needs of society have to constrain the concept of free market. It's a really good book. Yeah? I think the title needs to be a bit more serious, but it makes it easily memorable. Yeah? So anyway, complexity deals with systems which are basically constantly changing. And people don't like that. But on a day-to-day basis in our families, we deal with it. It's not that we don't know how to deal with complexity, but it's how we manage children. We kind of forget about it when we come to work. In fact, I have a basic heuristic. If you're not sure whether it will work, think, would it work with your teenage children? If it wouldn't work with your teenage children, why the hell do you think it will work at work? Yeah? Although just to scare you, there are consultants in the States now who come in and actually set KPIs for families, including writing family mission statements and identifying measurement protocols for the children. I put that along with the fact I'm not allowed to talk about evolution with the Ebola management teams in the States because it's a controversial theory, right? Yes, the States is quite a scary place at the moment, right? Don't talk about right-wing trolls. I actually got escorted by the FBI to a software testing conference at Nashville because I had to send off the tweets I got in from some NRA guys and they assessed it as credible threat, right? So right-wing trolls are scary. Now I got a Brit explaining the Second Amendment, all right, that was the fun one. Okay, so what I'm going to do is basically draw Cynefin for you. Yeah? Now there's a whole body of material on this, so I'm not going to spend much time on this, but I want to use it as a context. Cynefin looks like this. It's a 5-domain sense-making framework. It's not a model. A framework allows you to look at things from different perspectives. A model seeks to represent reality, and that's a big difference. There was a big blog post on this recently. Yeah? So basically, it identifies 4 main domains, all right? And it's not, I get people who talk about the 5 quadrants of Cynefin, which worries me about their education, right? It's like our former Prime Minister who said he wanted all schools to be above average, which rather indicates his wasn't for mathematical ability, right? And he went to Eton, right? Anyway, it identifies 4 main categories. So one is where the relationship between cause and effect is obvious to any reasonable person. So here you drive on the right, in the UK we drive on the left. Yeah? The relationship between cause and effect is self-evident to any reasonable person. Everybody buys into it. There may be exceptions. A child runs onto the road in front of you, but there's no controversy. So this is a domain of best practice. It's highly constrained, there's one right way of doing things, you can enforce it. The decision model is sense, categorize, respond. Yeah, it's one of these, this is what we do, yeah, it's kind of like pre-given. This is doctrine, best practice, procedures, it's all that sort of stuff. Nothing wrong with this. The trouble is, if you over-constrain it, you enter this space, yeah? And that's actually quite a dangerous space. You've over-constrained a system, you're forcing people to comply with rules they know are ridiculous. I can give you lots and lots of cases from IBM if you want, yeah? But the expense rules were the worst. Yeah, that we ended up with every country in the world had a different hotel rate by week that you could only claim, yeah, rather than management discretion. And what you ended up with is, I ended up always staying 4 nights in hotels, because then you were allowed to take your laundry with you and have it laundered at company expense, and you claimed every per diem you had. I mean, they were worse on that, all right? Like using blank taxi driver receipts to cover food for staff, because the regulations didn't allow it. Right? And just to say, some of our work at the moment is to identify the waste being caused by excessive regulation, which appears to be efficient on the surface, but is driving massive inefficiency underneath. Yeah? So over-constraint of rules means you fall over the edge into chaos. And chaos is a domain where there are no constraints. Yeah? It's a major crisis. Yeah? In that context, you act, sense, respond. But the good news is you get completely novel practice. One of the things I've introduced to a lot of companies is you have a crisis management process, trigger an innovation process in parallel. Because during the crisis, you've got a chance to innovate. Once the crisis is resolved, you won't. Yeah, it's a very simple procedural change, right? But I say, you don't want to get here because this is a space where you're going to fall over the edge. This is drawn as a cliff. Anybody knows this comes from René Thom's catastrophe theory. Yeah? You put regulation on regulation and then all of a sudden it breaks. Yeah, the last grain of sand on the sand pile and stuff like that. Yeah? So those are 2 domains where you can have draconian structured management. Yeah, one because everybody will buy in it, and actually in both cases you'll buy it. In a crisis, people will accept dictatorship. Yeah? The dominant spaces we work with are where the relationship between cause and effect is complicated. Yeah? Now, if it's complicated, it means there is a relationship between cause and effect, there is a right answer, but it's not self-evident and it has to be discovered. Yeah? So this is a traditional consultancy model. We sense, we analyse, respond, and we apply good practice, not best practice. One of the big problems we've got in the medical profession in the UK is people are using best practice for doctors, not good practice. So they don't get discretion. Yeah? And the trouble is the best practice is built on the assumption of single morbidity, average response, and doctors are dealing with multiple morbidity, non-average response. Yeah? So basically this is if you've got this education, you've got these qualifications, within these constraints you've got discretion. And that's called good practice. Yeah, best practice is this is the way you do it. One of the reasons we're losing doctors in the UK to Australia is we've destroyed their discretion. Their computer tells them what to do. They're not allowed to make a decision based on what they know about the individual. Yeah? So the good practice, best practice distinction is a really important one, and it means you spend less money. Yeah? We then get complex. In a complex world, you do parallel probes to discover what's possible. Now, you actually have to do a series of small experiments based on competing hypotheses, and it's only by acting in the system you discover what's sustainable. And actually anybody with real experience will tell you this anyway. Right? The complex domain is key. Practice there is X-adaptive. And that's a phrase you probably don't know, all right? It comes from evolutionary biology. So adaptation is a linear process which you can see in the fossil records. So for example, a dinosaur's feathers. And by the way, we now know that all dinosaurs had feathers. Fascinating stuff coming out of North China. So I'm a frustrated geologist. I wanted to do geology and physics at university, but my parents said there was no future in it, so I did physics and philosophy to teach them a lesson. Right? But I'm still a frustrated geologist. Give me a geology hammer and I'm really happy. Right? So either way, what you actually see is feathers developed on dinosaurs for warmth and sexual display. You see actually limbs developed to provide display panels for sex. Yeah? But then some of those dinosaurs fall from trees, and that's how we get flight. Yeah, so a trait which evolves for one function under conditions of stress exapts for something completely different. Yeah? You see the same with the cerebellum at the base of your brain. It evolved to manipulate muscles in fingers. In humans, it exapts to manage grammar in language. Grammar couldn't have happened in a linear way. Now, if you think that's not relevant to today, well, last night I discovered yet another way of improvising a spoon to drink yogurt in a hotel room without spoons. It goes on all the ways I've learned to open beer bottles late at night without an opener, right? We're tremendously creative as a species. And just to throw one in for you, the reason is, and it's actually the reason for the evolution of art in humans, art comes before language in human evolution. And it turns out what art allows us to do is to go up a level of abstraction and create novel connections. And that in biology is called exadaptation. So if you focus on STEM education, you're potentially destroying the capacity to innovate. It turns out art is actually critical to this because of abstraction. So either way, learning in the complex space tends to be rapid repurposing. You can't predict what's going to happen, and you have to make use of what you've got. Now, exaptive learning can be very powerful. So when a Raytheon engineer in 1947 notices a chocolate bar melts in their pocket and realizes the significance of it, we get microwave ovens. Yeah, loads of Raytheon engineers didn't notice that. They just swore and had their trousers clean. The history of technology, in particular the history of pharmaceuticals, is actually a history of exaptation, not adaptation. Yeah, so actually one of the things we do in a complex space is we make sure we have sufficient redundancy, that there's sufficient material that people can adapt very quickly to unforeseeable circumstances. Yeah? And systems for exaptive learning are narrative-based, ambiguous, not structured. And notice on this, coming back to the earlier question here, everything on the right can be documented. Everything on the left can be partially documented, but you adopt different processes. Now, just to throw it, I'm not going to spend time on it, Cynefin actually has a liminal aspect. So this is the process of transition from complex to complicated. Yeah? This is actually purposeful innovation or sense-making. I'm not going to go into that now, but that's your basic framework. You'll find a lot of articles using this in health and safety in multiple disciplines and multiple fields if you go on Google Scholar. Yeah? And the reason is it basically says work out which domain you're in and behave accordingly. Yeah? This here is called the domain of disorder, which can be valid, yeah, or it can be invalid. And that's the state of not knowing which domain you're in. Yeah? So if you have a single ontology framework, you make everything what you're most comfortable with. And that's one of the dangers we got. Yeah? So that's Cynefin. Now, that leads me on to narrative mapping, and this is based on a lot of work we've done over the years. This comes from the human terrain mapping, and this is also known as abductive research or distributed ethnography. So what we do is we get people, remember I talked about students with cab drivers capturing stories? We've done the same work by getting engineers capture narrative throughout their shift, yeah, in return for which they don't write a shift report. We're doing the same with nurses at the moment. If you capture continuous narrative throughout your shift, you don't have to write an end of shift report, because actually the real-time observational data is better for us than the end of shift report anyway. Yeah? First time we did this, the US Army in Afghanistan, we said you don't have to write a patrol report if you keep continuous observations in the field. Everybody complied with that, because if you don't know, I mean they're on 18-hour, 20-hour patrols, carrying pack weights, which means I think 2/3 of them will have to have knee replacement operations in their early 30s. Yeah? The weight of body armour is huge these days. Right? Now, actually, continuous capture is better for us anyway, because we can look at multiple human observations in real time from a military intelligence point of view, and we can combine it with our mechanical sensors, which means we've got human metadata overlaying mechanical metadata, and that allows us to actually do an awful lot of work on IED detection, yeah, improvised explosive devices. Yeah? And it's much better for military intelligence. Right? So that's what we're doing. Yeah? But the key on this is it has to be a quantitative approach, not a qualitative approach. And we need to be able to capture data in multiple forms. So we capture pictures or anything else. So it's easiest to show this before anybody asks the question. So this is a basic standard setup. This is actually a leadership one, not a safety one, to make the point. So what happens is people can type in a story. Yeah. They can take a photograph or use an existing photograph. So being as your health and safety, I'll show you an example of me getting it wrong. Yeah. Do not climb Welsh mountains early in the morning without breakfast, ill-properly equipped when you're very tired anyway, right? That resulted in 8 stitches, right? But I did walk down the mountain and I did drive to the hospital. I'm still quite proud of that, all right? And it's the best tweet I've ever written. Red Dawn on Triven is how I broadcast that one, all right? The family had never quite forgiven me for it. Right? I can record a story, yeah? And you notice this is any combination thereof. So we got nursing staff, for example, who will take a picture, record something, and the point is we're not going to interpret this by experts, neither are we going to allow computers to interpret it. The person who contributes the material will interpret it. Yeah? And the way that's done is by giving it a title. By the way, in health and safety this is important because we allow people to retain the story but share their interpretation, which means they can share failure more effectively. Yeah? Because they know they've got confidentiality to the source material that can only be released with their permission, but we've got their interpretation, yeah, which is what we really want for data analysis. So basically then we index it, and this is a method we developed. You're basically placing things onto triangles. Yeah, there's papers on this in safety. Yeah? Now the reason we use triangles is very simple. It creates a cognitive load. Remember thinking fast, thinking slow? If you have a Likert scale, you all know Likert scales, you know what answer people want. So you gift to your game, you don't think. You see people fill out a questionnaire, they're just going down it quickly. Yeah? Here you have to scroll around between up to 6 triangles, and what it does is you don't know what the right answer is, so it forces you into novelty receptive processing. So you get more effective data. And what we actually find is people don't interpret this story, they add layers of meaning to the story. Which is why when you give the stories to other people, they don't necessarily see it the same way. Yeah?
Are you labeling anchors or individual?
No. If the individual labelled it, there'd be no common data. The labels come from a classic literature search. Yeah, so you do a literature search, you identify the core concepts, and then you can validate the results. Yeah? Yeah?
I presume the spots you click on the triangle are basically into something numerical.
Yeah, so I can go back to this now. So what it basically ends up with, all right, is if I've got a triangle, then you index it here. I take that area and I allocate that area to that label.
But do you get a coordinate for it, or so you're turning it into something quantitative?
Yeah, I am. So basically, let's suppose I've got a triangle which says this is about past, present, future. That one we use on nearly all projects. It's quite fascinating where people think the relevance of the project, the story is. Yeah, that actually turns out to be useful. If somebody places the story here, yeah, then what they're actually saying is that is kind of like sort of 80% present, yeah, 10% past, 10% future. Okay? Now that gives me, and this all gets exported into our environment, so the statisticians amongst you, I can now do a hell of a lot with this, right? And the point is, people can't game input to output. They don't know what the right answer is, and this works off that abstract nature of human language. It works off cognitive load. That's the theoretical reason we do this. Yeah? Now that allows us to do some quite sophisticated things. So remember I mentioned the one we did. This is actually health and safety aerospace manufacture. So this is continuous capture, observational data, micro failures, engineers saying this smells wrongly. We had a really interesting one with water engineers looking for water leakage. We had a triangle there, said it smells wrong, it tastes wrong, it feels wrong. Yeah, now if you know water engineers, that was perfect, all right? They could just take a picture, slam it onto that. We got something like 100-fold increase in weak signal detection, and we got early indications of water leakage. Yeah, because you're allowing people, you're dealing with an ambiguous situation by ambiguous data, ambiguously interpreted. If you remove the ambiguity, you don't get what you want. Yeah, the indexing has to reflect it. Right? So this is, on the left-hand side, this is civilian manufacture. On the right-hand side, that's military manufacture. Yeah? And again, this is continuous capture, and this is a probability distribution. In complexity, it's called a fitness landscape. Yeah? So basically, a dense pattern of contours indicates a pattern of behavior which people can't escape from. Yeah? And what I've got here is two dominant patterns. Yeah? So if you look at this, the vertical dimension on this, by the way, is de facto rule compliance. The horizontal dimension is job completion. So you can immediately see in civilian, I've got an interesting question, because either people follow the rules or they get the job done. The two are mutually incompatible states. Now interestingly, every focus group, every interview, yeah, every workshop says they're doing both because they know that's the right answer. But the day-to-day observations of real engineers says something different. I presented this to the board, nobody challenged that. They kind of like knew it was happening, but now we had the evidence to support it. Yeah? Military looks a bit better because we got this group up here, yeah, which is rule compliance, job completion. That turns out to be nuclear weapons testing, which sort of creates an existential quality to rule compliance and job completion, and you never get starved of resources in that field because of the negative consequences. So it's not a replicable context. Yeah? We then got get the job done, ignore the rules, and we got this one, which is I've given up. That's the pattern we're seeing on nurses in hospitals. Yeah, and we're increasingly seeing this in government compliance as well. Yeah? Now that's the map at board level. Yeah? So now what the board have to do is to say, what can we do? Remember this concept of decisions within context? Yeah? I can't say everybody has to behave differently. I say, what can we as a board do? And here we come into a key thing. This here is called an adjacent possible. It's a cluster of micro-narrative, which is a much better place than here, but it's not there. To try and shift the thing up here is a journey too far. But we can shift it there. That's a stepping stone, an adjacent possible. So now as the board, we look at that, and then immediately the stories appear. So I've got the objectivity of numbers with the explanatory pattern of narrative. Yeah? I look at the stories and we say, what can we do tomorrow to create more like these, fewer like those? Now that is a whole new theory of change. Yeah? What can we as a board do tomorrow to create more like this, fewer like that? And the thing they came up with is you've got 10 years experience and somebody with at least 5 years experience signs it off, you can break the rules. But you've got to follow these heuristics and document it. Yeah, and that actually made a huge improvement in safety, yeah, in terms of the intervention, because it was a recognition there are times that you've got to break the rules. Well, okay, but you can only do it if you've got this amount of experience, somebody else agrees, and you go public. Right, and that was something the board just did. Yeah? Now the key thing about this is, of course, as you go down from that, sorry about this, I need to just slam a slide in quickly. So basically, if I then look at it, what I'll find is that, for example, Department A, exactly the same map might look like this. Same source data, that department has a different pattern. So what they've got to do is to say, how can we create more like these, fewer like those, more like these, fewer like those. Another department may have a pattern which looks like this. Well, actually, they've only got one problem down here, the rest is kind of like okay. And what they're doing is literally sitting down with the workers and saying, what do we do tomorrow to create more stories like this, fewer stories like that? People can come up with very novel ideas in that context, whereas they can't come up with novel ideas to say, how do we improve safety? Yeah? How do we create more stories like this, fewer stories like that, is more engaging. Yeah? So that's what we call fractal decision making. It also allows us to do some quite significant stuff. This is actually mapping. So this is where we do fundamental attitude mapping. So for example, we might take an infographic. We've done a lot of this in the South African mining industry. We take an infographic about ambiguous real-world situations where if you don't break the rules, people might die. But if you do break the rules, you might get punished. We then present that to the entire workforce. They index the infographic. They can add a narrative, which basically is why I've indexed it that way. And we also frequently add in a future scenario. What do you think will happen in the future in these circumstances? Now that's actually using chaos. Chaos is randomness. Nobody is connected with anybody else. That gives me a map. Right? This is actually a peace process. This is Colombia. So we've taken a scenario about the future of Colombian society. We got people from the Colombian military to index it, people from FARC to index it, government to index it. Right? Green is military, blue is government, blue is FARC, red is ministry. Now you can see at this point that is not a scenario about the future there's any point in having a discussion about, because the two dominant groups see it radically differently. The only thing they're agreed on is the red guys are a bunch of idiots. Yeah? Now our strategy here, which has actually worked quite well, is what we then start to say is, okay, what we need to do is to make that more extreme and that more extreme so we get a new central consensus. Now I say that in the context of peace and reconciliation. I've done that in safety as well. Yeah, the issue is, as long as you've got a rule system, which basically means, and I'll give you the political example. Part of the problem we've got in the States at the moment is every time the left wing in the States do something they think is right, they keep the centre of the right aligned with the extreme right. Because they just create stories which can be used to propagate. Yeah? Now you see this all the time, right? You've got to make the extremists more extreme so the centre's there. And it's exactly the same in attitudes to health and safety. Now the key point about this is what we're doing is we're measuring attitudes, not compliance. And attitudes are lead indicators, compliance is a lag indicator. Yeah, so cyber security, for example, something we developed with GCHQ, we're basically putting up an infographic about a major cyber security breach in industry. We're presenting that to all government employees, and in the same half-day period, that's critical, they index it and they tell the story of why it couldn't happen here, and they create a scenario about the future if it does. That allows us to map attitudes to cybersecurity. We can then make small changes now. What can we do tomorrow to create more like this, fewer like that? Rather than wait for a compliance breach, a point where we can't trust what anybody says. And by the way, we've just done a scenario planning exercise at the same time. Now this is probably one of the most important things I'm going to leave you with, is mapping attitudes to safety is 90% of the battle. Because at attitude level you can intervene, and if the attitudes are right, the compliance kind of like tends to follow. We tend to focus on an outcome, not the starting condition. And just to indicate where we're going with this, the other big piece of work we've done, this is within the counter-terrorism tradition, is where you get an actual terrorist outrage. You take all the casual observations of agents that you've built up in advance, you now know they're significant. So that's a training data set. I can then use that training data set to trigger alerts when a similar pattern follows. Yeah, and that's called an anticipatory alert. It's not saying to people terrorism is going to happen, it's saying the plausibility of terrorism has reached a critical threshold level. That's where we're also now working in safety. Every time you have a failure of safety, you gather the observations, which you now realize the significance of. Those become training data sets. You can then create alerts at a plant level, which basically says the plausibility of failure is increased. Now, one of the interesting things here for government is starting to create these as common systems with shared data, because people's thoughts about the future are not confidential, and we can do benchmarking and safety. Now at that point I need to finish off because I've actually run over, for which apologies, Ray's looking at me. Right? But I wanted to point out that what we've done here, sometimes complexity is called the science of common sense. Yeah? So the whole principle is recognize reality, map attitudes, modify attitudes, yeah, and actually hold this key distinction between rules and heuristics. Yeah, and recognize that tolerance of failure, the key thing is early detection, fast recovery, because actually that way failure is less impactful. If you try and pretend failure will never happen, failure gets suppressed, the tensions build up in the system, you get catastrophic failure. So I've given you the theory, I've given you some of the practice. It's not all of the available practice, this is stuff we're working on. Any questions? Yeah?
I'm still fixated on the figure a couple of slides back, and it was about, you were looking at the, so the X and Y axis,
Yeah.
following the rules, getting the job done. I'm trying to think of, I want to think the example of the adjacent possible in that situation.
You'd have to go to the raw data to get one.
But that's where you're trying to, so when you talk about nudging, you're trying to...
Yeah, and this is nudge, well, we're trying to avoid the nudge word because that's heavily associated with manipulation in behavioral economics, right? I mean, I famously said to Halpern, right, you guys don't nudge, you yank. Yeah, you decide where you want people to be and you try and manipulate it. What we can do is map when people are ready to change, which means you can nudge it when the system's ready to change. Yeah, and that's the difference. But the point is, the value on this is the raw anecdotes of the people you're dealing with, not abstract cases.
I'm just trying to visualize how it works in practice. You know what I mean? Is it about finding out what the adjacent possible stories are? If they were
No, there's a simple rule. No, because you've got them. Yeah, what you've got is on that map. So I mean, I haven't got a landscape up, but if I show you, if I go back to the raw triangles, right? So this is, yeah, that's the actual example. Yeah. So each dot represents a story. So what I can say is I want fewer like these, yeah, and more like those. I've deliberately chosen one in Arabic so you don't get fixated on the stories, all right? And I can actually say that is an adjacent possible to revenge. So shifting it down there is more likely to be successful.
Are you trying to figure out something that you can introduce?
No, it's already in the system. This is actually mapping the stories people have told in index. This actually represents what they themselves have said. Now, if you haven't got an adjacent possible, you might say, what could we do to create stories which will be indexed like this, so you get an adjacent possible? Yeah? But the point is, you're mapping what actually exists, and you're seeing what you can change. And you're doing that because you've got a distributed human sensor network self-interpreting their own material. All of that material, that one, all right, that was kids gathering stories from adults on the streets of Libya. Yeah? And so those are actual stories told by adults and indexed by adults, so actually it is an adjacent possible. It's a pattern of stories. Yeah? Any more? Yeah?
In the sort of continuous measurement piece that you talk about with the nurses, I'm just sort of curious about how much time is involved in doing that.
Yes, I gave this one yesterday, but I'm sharing this one. I would say that was a good question, but I learned not to do that in Australia once, where they said, we didn't ask you to rate your question, you pommy bastard, we asked you to answer it, right? Which is a good put down if you ever need to use it, right? Sorry, so... Yeah, remind me, I shouldn't...
Time consuming.
No, it isn't if you do it properly, right? The secret, it's an old rule of knowledge management I created. Never ask anybody to give you an hour unless you give them 2 hours back now. So never ask somebody to do something on the basis in a year's time my life will be easier because they won't do it. You've got to save time now. So what we do with nurses is say, if you keep continuous observations in this way, you don't have to write a shift report. Yeah? So what we're doing is, this is workbooks and journaling. Yeah? We send the same end of shift report, patrol report. Yeah? What we do is remove a burden from people in return for them doing something else, and we generally make it voluntary. If you want to write a shift report, carry on writing a shift report, but this is an alternative.
I'm just wondering, are you doing it like with iPads? Is it automated in that?
Yeah, completely. And the software that can be configured in half an hour, right? Once people have used it, you tend to end up with a thing being bespoke in their particular environment and open APIs, but that's downstream.
But it's more in terms of how frequently are they journaling, or that's the...
Well, that depends what you're trying to do, all right? So, for example, on a learning journal, this is what we do with leadership teams. It's every morning and every evening, and every time you notice something, all right? With patients, but we also now use in hospitals, every time you see a QR code or every time you see something abnormal. Now, patients are easy to motivate because it means they become subjects in their own health journey. With nurses, it's you record at the bedside like this, and you don't have to write it up later. Yeah, so the key thing is remove a burden to make it pervasive.